The storm explodes over the isolated Oregon coast. Inside a pitch-black bedroom, a paramedic, Ilara, gasps on the floor, her arm shattered. The man who killed her husband looms over her, his axe glinting in the dark. In the corner, a 150-pound failed SAR dog, Kodiak, trembles, a useless coward. He is hiding behind a 9-year-old boy, mute from trauma, who clutches a crayon sketch of headlights. The killer is laughing, but he has overlooked one detail. The axe is raised, but in the next second, a single scream will tear through 172 days of silence and unleash the hero hidden inside the coward. The room will transform from a tomb into a rescue. What happens next will prove that the most broken souls fight the hardest. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Astoria arrived not as a destination, but as a sentence. It was the place where the continent gave up, where the colossal muddy artery of the Columbia River finally bled into the indifferent gray of the Pacific. Ilara Vaughn had chosen it for this very reason. It was a place to end. The town clung to the steep forested hillsides under the constant tyranny of a leaden sky, the famous Astoria Megler Bridge looming in the perpetual mist like the skeleton of some forgotten leviathan. The air, thick with the smell of low tide, wet pine, and the metallic tang of the canneries, was a physical weight. It was here, in a small rented craftsman bungalow, smelling of damp wood and old grievances, that she had come to bury her ghosts. The house was isolated, set back from the road on a gravel drive that was already turning to mud. Inside, cardboard boxes sat sweating in the humidity, sagging monuments to a life she had frantically tried to pack away. Ilara Vaughn stood amidst the chaos, a woman disassembled. At 38, she still possessed the efficient, compact strength of a career paramedic, but it was a strength undermined by a tremor in her hands she couldn't seem to control. Her face, sharp-boned and intelligent, was pale, her hazel eyes clouded with an exhaustion that went deeper than sleeplessness. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, not for style, but to keep it from her face. One less thing to manage. She was a professional at managing chaos, yet she had failed the only emergency that mattered. "Silas," she said, her voice too thin in the damp air, "we need to find the box with the bedding. It's going to be cold tonight." Her son did not look up. Silas, 9 years old, was a ghost himself, small for his age with bird-like bones and his father's dark, serious eyes. But where his father's eyes had been warm, Silas's were wide and dark, absorbing the world in a terrible, unending silence. He had not spoken a word in the 72 days since he'd watched his father die on the rain-slicked asphalt of a Portland intersection. He was sitting cross-legged on the bare wooden floor, a perimeter of cardboard boxes fencing him in. In his lap was a sketch pad, and in his fist, a single black crayon. Ilara's breath hitched. She already knew what he was drawing. He was always drawing it. It wasn't a picture, it was an event, rendered in obsessive, violent strokes. The page was dominated by 2 enormous, angry yellow circles, the headlights of the truck that had run the red light. Between them, a chaotic spiderweb of black and silver wax lines represented the twisted metal of their sedan. He drew with such focused pressure that the crayon snapped, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Silas didn't flinch. He simply picked up the broken piece and continued, shading the darkness, the impact, with frantic, angry lines. "We can't leave that there, Si," Ilara murmured, moving closer. She knelt, her knees popping. The paramedic in her wanted to check his vitals, to assess the trauma clinically. The mother in her wanted to scream, just to see if he would react. "Let's find your bed. Your space station sheets are in one of these." He gave no indication he had heard her, save for his small shoulders tensing. His silence was an accusation, a wall she could no longer scale. He was trapped in that moment, and he had taken her in there with him. She turned away, forcing herself back to the task, the rhythm of unpacking. One box at a time. Assess, sort, store. It was a mantra that had saved lives. It couldn't save her. She slit the tape on a box labeled kitchen, the sound of the utility knife tearing the cardboard grating on her nerves. She pulled out a coffee mug, her own, the one that said paramedics are God's answer to stupid people. A bitter laugh escaped her. She had been standing 20 feet away, off duty, buying coffee when the call came over her radio, her own address. She had run, but Finn, the drunk driver, had gotten there first. She had done CPR on her own husband, tasting coffee and blood, until her colleagues had physically pulled her away. Whump, whump, whump. The sound was distant at first, a rotor beat against the heavy clouds, a Coast Guard helicopter, likely heading out from the base. But then another sound joined it, rising from the town below, a thin, piercing wail that sliced through the fog. A siren. Ilara's body reacted before her mind could. It was a galvanic shock. The coffee mug slipped from her trembling hand and shattered on the floor. Her breath seized in her chest, her lungs turning to concrete. The sound was not just a sound, it was the smell of gasoline and ozone, the grinding crunch of the jaws of life, the sterile beep of the flatline. It was the sound of her own failure arriving too late. She backed against a stack of boxes, her hands flying to her ears, her knuckles white. No, no, make it stop, she whispered, her paramedic's composure shattering like the mug at her feet. She was no longer in Astoria. She was on the pavement, the rain cold on her face, her hands covered in Mark's blood. The siren faded, swallowed by the hills, but Ilara remained frozen, hyperventilating. It was only when a new sound broke the spell, a sharp, insistent knock, that she blinked, the damp bungalow rushing back into focus. Silas hadn't moved. He was just staring at her, his dark eyes wide, the broken crayon clutched in his fist. He had seen this before. The knock came again, harder. Wiping her clammy hands on her jeans, Ilara forced her legs to move. She opened the door to a woman who looked as if she'd been carved from coastal driftwood. She was tall and impossibly thin, with a leathery, wind-burned face and a braid of steel-gray hair so tight it seemed to pull her eyes back. This was Sarah Callio, the landlady, a woman whose family had apparently been pulling salmon from the Columbia since before Oregon was a state. She wore flannel and heavy-duty waders and held a small, rust-stained toolbox. "Figured you were in," Sarah said, her voice a low gravel, skipping any pleasantries. "The weather's turning. Wind'll come from the southwest tonight. You'll hear it in the attic." She peered past Ilara into the house, her sharp blue eyes taking in the scattered boxes, the broken ceramic on the floor, and the small, silent boy in the corner. "Drop this. Old house. The faucet in the tub drips if you don't wrench it right." She handed Ilara a small, specialized wrench. "Thank you," Ilara managed, her voice still shaky. "I broke a mug." Sarah's gaze drifted to Silas, then to the sketch pad in his lap. She saw the angry yellow circles. "Kid's an artist, eh?" she noted, though without warmth. Her eyes returned to Ilara, assessing her with a practical, almost invasive scrutiny. "This town, it's not a gentle place, Mrs. Vaughn. It chews up people who aren't tied down. You need groceries. The Safeway is on the East End. Don't bother with the local market unless you want to pay twice as much for jam." She nodded once, a curt, bird-like gesture, and turned. "Lock your deadbolt, not 'cause of crime, 'cause the wind'll blow the door open otherwise." Ilara watched her stride back to a battered blue Ford pickup, disappearing into the thickening fog. She closed the door, the finality of the latch clicking shut echoing in the room. She was locked in. The wind was already beginning to whine around the eaves, just as Sarah had predicted. Night fell quickly, not as a gentle fade, but as if a black, wet blanket had been thrown over the house. Ilara didn't bother unpacking. She swept up the broken mug, her hands shaking so badly she cut her finger on a shard. She stared at the bright bead of her own blood, feeling profoundly, terribly awake. Later, she found Silas asleep on the floor, curled up on his side, his sketch pad clutched to his chest like a shield. The black crayon was still gripped tightly in his hand. She found a blanket in a box and draped it over him, her movements stiff and automatic. She sat on a sealed box marked MISC, listening to the house groan under the assault of the rising storm, the wail of the wind sounding too much like the siren that had torn her life apart. She had run to the end of the world to escape the past, only to find it had been waiting for her all along, trapped in the silence of her son and the violent strokes of his crayon. The storm had passed, leaving Astoria scoured and weeping under a sky the color of old pewter. The wind's howl had been replaced by an oppressive stillness in the small rental house, a silence punctuated only by the rhythmic, agonizing scratch, scratch, scratch of Silas's black crayon. Ilara had watched him for an hour, sitting at the rickety kitchen table, his small shoulders hunched. He was drawing the crash again. The two glaring headlights, the chaotic vortex of twisted metal. It was a ritual, a prayer to a god that had abandoned them. She couldn't watch it for one more minute. The desperate, claustrophobic need to act, the The same instinct that made her a good paramedic seized her. It was a gamble, a terrible one, but the silence was devouring them. "Get your coat, Si," she said, her voice overly bright. "We're going for a drive." Her destination was not one of hope, but of last resort. The Clatsop County Animal Shelter was a low-slung cinder-block fortress tucked behind the waste transfer station, a place where the sharp tang of pine-scented bleach did little to mask the underlying scent of despair and damp fur. The lobby was cramped, and the sound of barking, a frantic cacophony of pleas and terror, hit them like a physical force. Silas immediately clapped his hands over his ears, his small body rigid, his eyes screwed shut. Alara felt a mirroring panic. The high-pitched yelps were too close to other sounds, other emergencies. A heavy door buzzed open, and a man emerged, wiping his hands on a towel that had seen better days. He looked to be in his late 50s, a man worn down to the studs. His face was a map of exhaustion, with a thin, graying beard that failed to conceal the deep lines of resignation etched around his mouth and eyes. His flannel shirt was clean but frayed, and his name tag, pinned crookedly, read, Malcolm. He had the eyes of someone who had seen too many hopeful beginnings turn into sad returns. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, not unkind, but heavy with fatigue. "We're just looking," Ilara stammered, already feeling the futility of the trip. "For a dog. A quiet one." Malcolm's gaze drifted from Ilara's strained face to the small, tense boy hiding behind her. He registered Silas's hands clamped over his ears, and for a moment, his weary expression softened, just barely. "Quiet is a tall order in here," he sighed, the sound more air than word. "But they're all back this way. Mind the floor. It's wet." He led them through the door into the kennel run, and the sound exploded. It was a concrete canyon of desperation. Dozens of dogs, lean hounds, shivering pit bulls, frantic terriers, threw themselves against the chain-link gates, barking, snarling, whining. The noise was metallic and sharp, echoing off the hard surfaces, and it struck a raw nerve in Ilara. It was the sound of metal shearing, the crunch of a hydraulic spreader, the shriek of tires. She fought the bile rising in her throat, her own hands, beginning to tremble. This was a mistake. Silas was now vibrating, his eyes still squeezed shut, a silent prisoner in a world of noise. "As you can see, it's a full house," Malcolm said, raising his voice over the din. "This one just came in, great with kids." Ilara was already shaking her head, grabbing Silas's shoulder to steer him out. "I'm sorry, we can't." "Wait," Malcolm said, stopping her. He pointed to the very last kennel, set apart from the others, near a steel fire door. It was dark and ominously silent. "We've got one more. He's not part of the general population. He's complicated." Ilara, against her better judgment, hesitated. She followed Malcolm to the last cage. At first, she thought it was empty. Then, in the deepest, darkest corner, she saw a shadow move, or rather, she saw it tremble. It was a mountain of fur, a massive creature huddled into itself, its enormous head tucked beneath its plumed tail. It was a dog that seemed too big for its own fear. "My God, what is it?" Ilara whispered. "That," Malcolm said, his voice dropping, "is Kodiak, 3-year-old Leon Berger, a 150-pound washout." He leaned against the wall, the story clearly one he'd told before. He was a rock star search and rescue candidate, trained up on Mount Hood, perfect scores, until his first real field test. What happened? "A car went off the road in a blizzard," Malcolm explained, his eyes fixed on the trembling dog. "He tracked it, no problem. But when he got there, the noise of the wreck, the smell of gasoline and oil, the metal, he just shut down, froze, wouldn't go near the victim. His handler, a big-shot rescuer, had to pull him off, brought him here 2 weeks later, said he was gun-shy, permanently broken. This is his third shelter. He gets adopted, there's a thunderstorm or a car backfires, and he's right back here. He's terrified of the world." Ilara stared at the magnificent, terrified beast. A dog whose trauma was triggered by the same sounds that haunted her. A failure. "He's just like us," she murmured, unaware she'd spoken aloud. But Silas had moved. He had unglued himself from his mother's side, his hands slowly, tentatively, dropping from his ears. The chaos of the kennel was behind them, and in this small bubble there was only the sound of the dog's shivering breath. Silas crept forward, his small sneakers silent on the concrete. He stopped 2 feet from the chain link, his head tilted. He was so small, and the dog was so enormous. Kodiak didn't look up. He only flinched, curling tighter, a low, guttural whine of pure terror caught in his massive chest. "Silas, honey, don't," Ilara warned, her own nerves frayed. Silas ignored her. He sank to his knees on the cold, damp floor. He didn't reach out. He didn't make a sound. He just knelt, his small 9-year-old body a perfect tiny mirror of the dog's overwhelming fear. He just watched. And then he reached into the pocket of his hoodie. He pulled out the sketch pad and the stub of black crayon. Ilara's heart stopped. Malcolm, who had seen everything, went utterly still. Silas flipped to a clean page. The scratch of the crayon was the only sound. He began to draw, but he wasn't drawing the headlights. He wasn't drawing the twisted metal. He was drawing the dog. He drew the massive hunched shoulders, the head tucked in shame, the bars of the cage. Kodiak's trembling hitched. His ears, satellites of fear, twitched. Slowly, agonizingly, the great noble head lifted from beneath the tail. One amber eye, clouded with misery, peered out. It fixed on the small, silent boy. The boy who was not trying to touch him, not trying to coax him, but was simply seeing him. Silas finished his drawing. He turned the pad around, holding up the portrait of fear for the dog to see. Then, Silas Vaughn, the boy who hadn't made a single voluntary gesture of connection in 172 days, pressed his open palm flat against the cold chain link. Kodiak stared at the small hand. He didn't approach. He didn't retreat. He just held the gaze. The violent shivering in his body subsided, just for a second. Silas turned, his face pale but set in the moonlight. He looked directly at his mother. His eyes, for the first time in months, were not vacant. They were fierce. He said nothing, but his message was brutally clear. He pointed one small, determined finger at Kodiak. Then, he pointed that same finger back at his own chest. "He's me." The weight of the silent declaration hung in the air, heavier than the coastal fog. Ilara looked at the broken boy, the broken dog, and her own shattered reflection in the observation window. This was madness. It was tying a second anchor to their already sinking ship. "I'll take him," Ilara said, the words surprising her as much as they did Malcolm. "We'll take Kodiak." Getting Kodiak into the car had required Malcolm's help, and a betrayal in the form of a hot dog bribe. The drive back to the isolated rental was a 150-pound exercise in shared terror. Kodiak didn't sit. He collapsed onto the floor of Ilara's SUV, trembling so violently that the entire vehicle seemed to vibrate with his fear. Silas sat in the back, silent, his knees drawn to his chest, his eyes fixed on the mass of shivering fur. He made no move to touch the dog. It was not a homecoming, it was a transfer of inmates. At the house, Kodiak refused to exit the vehicle. Ilara spent 20 minutes tugging and pleading, her paramedic's command voice having no effect on the terrified animal. Finally, defeated, she simply opened the back hatch and left it, going inside with Silas. An hour later, as the infamous Astoria drizzle began to thicken, the dog finally slunk out, a great matted shadow of misery, and bolted for the porch. He did not explore the house. He did not sniff the corners or wag his tail. He bypassed the living room, ignored Silas, and went straight to the kitchen. There, he jammed his enormous frame under the small, rickety breakfast table, a space pathetically inadequate for his size. He lay with his head on his paws, facing the wall, a living statue of despair. "Well," Ilara said to the empty room, her voice flat, "he's home." For 3 days, this was the new normal. The house now contained 2 silent, traumatized dependents. Silas would sit on the kitchen floor, just outside the dog's perimeter, and draw. He didn't draw Kodiak again. He had returned to his mantra of headlights and shattered metal. The scratch of his crayon was the only sound, a metronome of their shared misery. Kodiak, for his part, only moved to drink water when he thought no one was looking, or to eat the food Ilara left for him in the dead of night. The disappointment Ilara felt was a cold, bitter thing. She had made a desperate, emotional gamble and lost. This was not a protector. It was a mirror. It was another breathing creature that was as broken as she was. On the 4th morning, the trigger came. A heavy logging truck, its trailer empty and rattling, geared down as it approached the sharp curve near their driveway. The percussive, high-pressure PSS thunk of its air brakes cut through the morning mist. Alara flinched, a jolt of adrenaline tightening her throat, the sound an echo of the semi that had T-boned her husband's car. From the kitchen came a different sound, a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, a noise of pure animal terror, followed by a frantic scrambling. Alara ran in to find Kodiak convulsing. He was no longer under the table. He was trying to claw his way into the drywall, his massive paws scrabbling uselessly at the linoleum. He had defecated in fear. He was whining, a terrible thin sound for such a powerful creature. His eyes rolled back, pupils dilated. Silas was in the doorway, his sketch pad on the floor. He was just watching the dog self-destruct. "No!" Alara yelled, her voice cracking. It was all too much. The smell, the fear, the noise. She grabbed the dog's collar, her professional training kicking in. "Kodiak, look at me! You are fine!" But her hands were shaking, and the dog, sensing her own panic, only scrambled harder. She shoved him back under the table, grabbed paper towels, and cleaned up the mess with the cold, detached fury of an ER nurse cleaning a wound. She was scrubbing the floor, tears of rage blurring her vision, when she realized she couldn't breathe. The house was suffocating her. "I'm going out," she announced to her silent son and her terrified dog. "Don't, just stay." She grabbed her keys and fled. She drove into town, not caring where, just needing to be away from the two broken things she had trapped herself with. She found herself at the Safeway on the East End, as Sarah Kallio had instructed. She walked the aisles in a daze, grabbing essentials, milk, bread, coffee, bleach, the mundanity of the task a flimsy barrier against her hysteria. The store was sterile, fluorescent, and blessedly normal. She was pushing her cart back to her car when she decided, impulsively, that she couldn't go back to the house. Not yet. She needed a buffer. She drove down to the waterfront, past the tourist traps, to the working docks. She knew there was an old diner there, the Wet Anchor, a place that smelled of fried oysters and stale coffee. She just wanted to sit and hear the sound of other human beings talking about things that didn't matter. She parked and was walking toward the diner when she saw the work crew. They were offloading ice into the hold of a trawler, their movements efficient, their voices rough, laughing as they worked. The air was frigid, and their breath plumed in the air. And then she saw him. He was separate from the others, coiling a heavy rope on the dock. Prison had stripped the drunk from him, leaving something harder in its place. He was leaner than she remembered from the trial, the muscles in his forearms and neck defined and corded from a prison weight yard. His name was Finn O'Doherty. He had a sharp, almost feral face, with a prominent brow and eyes set a little too close together. A jagged scar, new since his conviction, ran from his left eye to his jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent mocking sneer. A sloppy, hand-poked tattoo of a teardrop marked his eye, a stark black declaration. He looked up as a truck passed, and Alara saw his profile. He was exactly as she remembered, and terrifyingly different. Alara stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. A bag of groceries slipped from her grasp, oranges rolling across the wet pavement. "It's not him." It can't be. He had been sentenced to 7 years, with parole in 4. It had only been 2. 2 years. 2 years for a life. Overcrowding, good behavior. The excuses she had heard on the news now felt like a personal, violent betrayal. He wasn't in Portland. He was here, in Astoria, in her sanctuary. He was breathing her air, walking free, laughing with the other men. He had destroyed her world and had simply moved on. She scrambled back into her car, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She drove, not seeing the road, her mind racing. The isolation of her rental, once a comfort, now felt like a fatal vulnerability. She was on a dark road, with a nonverbal child, a useless dog, and a killer working 5 miles away. There was a different hardware store on the edge of town, one that smelled of sawdust, oiled steel, and old-fashioned independence. It was called Jean's Sporting and Marine. She walked in, her hands still shaking, but her face set in a cold, clinical mask. The man behind the counter, Gene, looked like he'd been there since the logging boom. He was in his late 60s, with a face like a worn leather boot, a magnificent white mustache, and clear, assessing blue eyes. He wore a red flannel shirt and suspenders. "Help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a friendly baritone. I need a firearm, Ilara said, her voice a flat, dead calm. For home defense. Something simple, reliable. Gene's friendly expression didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. He'd lived in Astoria long enough to know the difference between a hobbyist and a woman in fear. You have your Oregon firearms ID? I have my paramedic certification and state license, Ilara said, pulling out her wallet. I've passed every background check the state has. I need it today. He nodded, a slow, understanding gesture. A .38 revolver then. Point and shoot. Not much to go wrong. He turned, retrieved a small, dark gray handgun, and laid it on the counter. You know how to use one of these? I will, Ilara said. She paid in cash. She bought the gun, a cleaning kit, and 2 boxes of .38 special ammunition. The weight of the small cardboard ammo boxes in her shopping bag felt obscene next to the loaf of bread. When she returned home, the house was exactly as she'd left it, silent. Silas was on the floor, drawing headlights. Kodiak was under the table, his head on his paws, his large amber eyes tracking her every move, reflecting nothing but her own fear. Ilara went to her bedroom. She took out her old paramedic trauma bag, the one she hadn't opened since she'd left the service. It was full of sterile gauze, tourniquets, and intubation tools. She placed the .38 revolver, still in its box, at the very bottom, beneath a set of chest decompression needles. It was a place Silas would never look, a place that was hers alone. She stood in the hallway, listening. The only sounds were the scratch of the crayon and the whine of the wind. She was a trained lifesaver, and she had just brought a tool designed for the exact opposite into her home. The acquisition of the .38 revolver did not bring peace. It brought a cold, heavy weight. The gun lived not in her trauma bag, but in the drawer of her bedside table, a compact block of steel nestled between a paperback copy of Advanced Cardiac Life Support and a single, forgotten silver earring of her own. The gun changed the geography of the house. The house was no longer a home. It was a perimeter. Ilara's paranoia became a routine. She checked the locks twice, then a third time. She wedged a chair under the back doorknob, a flimsy defense that felt absurdly necessary. She found herself staring into the woods, the dense, dripping tangle of Douglas fir and sword fern that encroached on the small yard. The trees, once a symbol of sanctuary, now felt like a shroud, a perfect blind for anyone watching, and she felt, constantly, that she was being watched. The silence in the house remained, but its texture had changed. It was no longer the heavy silence of grief. It was the thin, strained silence of a held breath. Silas still drew his obsessive hieroglyphs of the crash. Kodiak still lived under the kitchen table, a 150-pound monument to broken courage. The first sign came a week after her visit to the docks. She opened the front door to a morning thick with fog. The air so saturated it felt like walking through a cloud. She was intending to check the mail, a simple act that now required a steeling of her nerves. On the choir welcome mat, placed with a grotesque theatrical precision, was the severed head of a massive lingcod. Its eye, milky and opalescent in the gray light, stared up at her. Its jaw was open, lined with needle-like teeth, a silent, gaping accusation. Ilara's training kept her from screaming, her stomach clenched, and the metallic taste of adrenaline flooded her mouth. This was not the work of a raccoon. This was not a seagull. She had worked enough shifts in Portland to recognize a message. The fish was fresh, still weeping blood onto the mat. It smelled of salt and the deep, cold bottom of the river. It smelled like the docks. From the kitchen, a low, miserable whine, Kodiak. He could smell it from 20 feet away. He hadn't barked. He hadn't moved to investigate. He had only pressed himself further into the corner under the table, his nails scraping the linoleum. Shaking, Ilara grabbed a shovel, scooped the head off the mat, and flung it deep into the woods. She scrubbed the mat with bleach until her knuckles were raw, the chemical smell mixing with the lingering odor of the river. She called the Astoria police. An hour later, a cruiser rolled up the drive. The officer who stepped out looked impossibly young, barely old enough to shave. His name tag read Officer Riley. He had a boyish, freckled face and the slightly too large uniform of a rookie trying to grow into his authority. He listened to her with a practiced, patient air, his gaze drifting from her pale, intense face to the still damp spot on her porch. "A fish. Head, ma'am?" he asked, trying to keep the skepticism from his voice. "It was placed, officer. It was a message from the docks." Riley sighed, a small puff of condensation in the cold air. Ma'am, with all due respect, this is Astoria. We've got bald eagles, seagulls, raccoons the size of small dogs. They drop parts all the time. I had a lady on 12th Street call last week because a gull dropped a whole crab on her windshield. It's just the coast. This was not an animal, Alara insisted, her voice rising, sounding hysterical even to her own ears. I know the difference. Are you having trouble with anyone? A domestic dispute? A problem with a neighbor? Alara froze. The words were on her tongue. Finn O'Doherty, the man who killed my husband. He's here. But she saw how he was looking at her, a high-strung woman from the city, already unraveling. She had no proof. It was just a fish. No, she said, her voice dropping. No dispute. Officer Riley nodded, his expression settling into one of mild pity. Okay, well, I'll make a note of it. Vandalism, maybe. But honestly, Mrs. Vaughn, it was probably a seagull. You should try to get some rest. He clicked his pen, tipped his hat, and left her standing in the doorway, feeling more isolated than ever. The dismissal confirmed her terror. She was alone. The police were not coming. The real escalation came 2 nights later. The storm returned, not with the drama of the previous week, but as a cold, relentless, drilling rain that turned the yard into a primordial soup of mud. Alara was in bed, the .38 on her nightstand, listening to the rain. Sometime after midnight, Kodiak began to whine. It was not his usual tremor of fear. It was a low, constant, keening sound, the noise of an animal in deep, sustained distress. Cody, shut up, Alara hissed into the darkness, her heart hammering. The whining didn't stop. It was punctuated by the soft thump, thump, thump of his tail, not wagging, but beating a frantic, terrified rhythm against the kitchen cabinet. Alara lay awake until dawn, clutching the gun. When morning came, the rain had eased, but the world was gray and saturated. She made coffee, her hands shaking, and then, wrapping her coat around her, she stepped outside to do her perimeter check. The fish had been on the front porch. The back of the house was more vulnerable, facing the dark woods. She walked the property line, her boots sinking into the mud. And then she saw them. They were unmistakable. The mud, churned and wet, held the impressions perfectly. Deep, heavy boot prints, waffle tread, like a work boot. They emerged from the tree line, walked directly to the house, and stopped. They were right outside Silas's window. The mud was disturbed in a small circle, as if someone had stood there, watching, for a long, long time, before turning and walking back into the woods. Alara's blood ran cold. He hadn't tried to get in. He had just come to show her that he could. He had stood feet away from her sleeping silent child. A primal rage, cold and sharp, cut through her fear. She stormed back inside, straight to the kitchen. Kodiak was huddled in his corner, his eyes wide. She grabbed his collar. No, not today. She physically dragged the 50-pound dog out the back door. He fought her, his paws digging in, but her adrenaline-fueled strength was absolute. She dragged him through the mud to the footprints. "Smell it!" she screamed, shoving his nose toward the impression. "This is what you're for. Do something. Protect us." Kodiak's reaction was immediate and visceral. He smelled the track, the scent, a mixture of river mud, diesel, and Finn's specific predatory musk, hit his nose, and his body locked. His hackles rose. A deep, agonizing whine tore from his chest. He backed away, his body trembling so hard he almost fell. "Track him!" Alara yelled, yanking his collar. But Kodiak wasn't a guardian. He was a victim. The scent terrified him. He pulled against her, not toward the woods, but frantically, desperately, back toward the house. He dragged her through the mud, his only instinct to get back to the kitchen, back to the table, back to the wall. Alara finally let go of his collar. He scrambled away from her and disappeared inside. She stood in the rain, staring at the boot prints, and then at the empty doorway where her protector had fled. Kodiak wasn't agitated. He was terrified. The scent of the predator had confirmed what she already knew. The dog was not a guardian. He was not a rescuer. He was just one more broken thing. She was utterly, terrifyingly on her own. The discovery of the boot prints outside Silas's window shattered the last fragile membrane of Alara's denial. The house was no longer a refuge. It was a target. Her paralysis broke, replaced by the cold, frantic energy of a paramedic at a mass casualty scene. She moved Silas's mattress into her own room, dragging it across the hall and placing it on the floor beside her bed. She told him it was a sleepover, a camp-out against the coming rain. He looked at her with his dark, knowing eyes, gripped his sketchpad, and complied without a sound. The .38 revolver, cold and dense, moved from her nightstand drawer to the deep pocket of her jeans, where its weight was a constant, solid, and utterly terrifying presence against her thigh. She stopped pretending to eat, surviving on black coffee and the acidic burn of adrenaline. She didn't call Officer Riley again. The memory of his patronizing dismissal was almost as sharp as the image of the footprints. He stood right there. He watched my son sleep. And the dog ran away. This thought, this triad of failure, became her new reality. The warnings began as a crackle on the small battery-powered radio she had salvaged from an emergency kit. She kept it on the kitchen counter, its voice the only one in the house beside her own. The announcer, a man with the unnervingly calm voice of a local who had seen it all, spoke of an atmospheric river, a pineapple express barreling in from the Pacific. He used phrases like hurricane-force gusts, significant coastal flooding, and widespread prolonged power outages. The projected wind speeds, 80, 90 miles per hour, were dismissed with a casual, "You all know the drill, hunker down, check your batteries, and don't park under any big trees." Ilara looked out the window. The sky was a sickly, bruised yellowish green, a color she associated with a developing compartment syndrome, a sign of severe trauma beneath the skin. The air was unnaturally still, heavy, and charged, as if the world was holding a deep systemic breath before cardiac arrest. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond meteorology, that this was not just a storm. It was a cover. It was an opportunity. Down at the docks, the wind would be picking up, and Finn O'Doherty, a man who knew this coast, who knew these back roads, would be watching this same toxic sky, and he would know exactly what it meant. The storm did not arrive. It impacted. At 5:17 p.m., as the light failed completely, the first gust hit the house like a physical blow. It was not a whistle. It was a low, vibrational roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The entire rental house groaned, the old-growth timbers shifting in protest. The windows bowed visibly inward, the glass vibrating with a low-frequency hum. And then the rain came. It did not fall. It moved horizontally, a solid wall of water traveling at 90 miles per hour. It sounded less like rain and more like handfuls of gravel being fired from a cannon against the siding. In the bedroom, Silas, who had been drawing, dropped his crayon. He stared at the window, his face a pale oval in the gloom. From the kitchen came a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, a noise of pure animal terror. Kodiak. He was no longer under the table. He was scrambling, trying to claw his way into the pantry, his massive body colliding with the flimsy door in a frantic thump, thump, thump. The lights flickered once, twice, a pathetic, dying surge, and then vanished with a definitive pop. The house was plunged into absolute roaring darkness. Ilara's paramedic mind instantly went into triage mode. Airway, breathing, circulation. She clicked on the heavy-duty flashlight she'd taken from her car, its beam cutting a cone of shocking clarity through the dust-filled air. "It's okay, Si," she lied, her voice tight. "Just a storm. We have batteries." She grabbed her cell phone. No service. The local tower was down, useless. She moved to the landline, the old beige phone on the wall. She picked it up. A hollow, empty void. The faint hiss of the dead line was, for a moment, louder and more terrifying than the storm itself. No power, no phone. "Stay here," she commanded Silas, her voice the one she used at crash scenes. She had to know. She fought her way to the front door, the wind trying to rip it from her grasp as she opened it a crack. She shone the maglite beam toward the end of their long gravel driveway. The creek, usually a gentle, mossy trickle, was now a brown, churning, angry river. It had breached its banks. The small wooden bridge that connected their drive to the main road was not just flooded, it was gone. A mass of splintered timbers and debris was wedged against the bank where it used to be. No power, no phone, no bridge. As if to punctuate the thought, a sound separate from the storm, a deep tearing crack that sounded like artillery fire, ripped through the air, followed by a ground-shaking thud that she felt in her teeth. She aimed the light down the driveway, A massive Douglas fir, an ancient moss-covered giant, had fallen. It lay across the gravel road like a fortress wall, its root ball a gaping, muddy wound in the earth. It had taken the power pole with it. It was perfect, a perfect trap. Alara slammed the door, shooting the deadbolt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They were completely, utterly cut off. Not even a Humvee could reach them now. No one was coming. The storm had sealed them in. She went back to the bedroom. Silas was on the mattress, his knees drawn to his chest. Alara didn't bother with candles. They were a fire hazard, and she needed her hands free. She set the flashlight on the dresser, aiming it at the ceiling so the light reflected downward, casting the room in a pale, grim twilight. She sat on her bed, her back against the headboard, facing the door. The .38 was in her hand, its checkered grip feeling small and sweating in her palm. From the hallway, Kodiak's frantic scrambling had stopped. The high-pitched shrieks were gone. A new sound replaced it, a low, constant, terrified whimper. Alara stood, shining the light down the hall. The dog was not in the kitchen. He had army crawled from his hiding place and was now pressed flat against the wall outside her bedroom door, as close to her and Silas as he could get. He was trembling violently, his nose pointed not at the front door, but at the back door. He wasn't whining about the storm. The wind was just noise. He could smell something. He could smell something through the wind and the rain. Something that terrified him more than the falling trees and the roaring darkness. The same scent he had smelled on the boot prints. Alara's blood turned to ice. He's already here. The storm wasn't his cover to get here. It was his cover to act. She reached out and clicked off the flashlight, plunging the room into total, suffocating darkness. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a dry, papery rasp, barely audible over the roar of the wind. "Get in the closet and do not make a sound." The blackness was absolute, a physical, suffocating void that swallowed all light. The storm was no longer just noise. It was the world vibrating, the entire house groaning like the hull of a ship tearing itself apart. The wind didn't whistle, it roared, a deep primal bass note of infinite rage. Alara stood in the doorway of the bedroom, the .38 heavy and cold in her right hand, her left hand braced against the frame. Her breathing was shallow, disciplined, the only sound she could control. From the closet she heard a different breath, a tiny, hitched, terrified whimper. Silas. He was hidden. And in the hallway, pressed flat to the floor, was the sound of Kodiak, a low, constant, agonizing keen. His nose was pointed down the hall, toward the kitchen, toward the back door. He was a 150-pound seismic sensor tuned to a single terrifying frequency. He was smelling Finn O'Doherty, and the storm was providing the predator with perfect, deafening cover. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. It was not the wind. It was not the rain. It was different. Scrape! Thunk! It was the sound of the flimsy patio chair she had wedged under the back doorknob, sliding an inch across the linoleum, pushed by a methodical, probing force. "Alara," she whispered to herself, her paramedic training trying to force calm. Assess, triage, act. She raised the revolver, extending her arm into the blackness of the hall, pointing it toward the kitchen. "Get back!" she yelled, her voice sounding thin and weak against the storm. "I'm armed! The police have been called!" A laugh. It was a low, wet sound, barely audible, or perhaps just a trick of the wind. Kodiak's whine escalated into a frantic series of yelps. And then, the breach. There was no finesse, no lock-picking. There was only a single, explosive crack of splintering wood that was louder than the thunder. Finn had put his shoulder through the back door, shattering the jamb, ripping the deadbolt from the soft pine. The chair went flying, clattering uselessly into the darkness. The storm instantly invaded the house. A tidal wave of wind and freezing rain blasted through the kitchen, a sudden, violent change in pressure that made the interior doors slam in their frames. The house was open. He was in. Alara stood her ground in the bedroom doorway, her knuckles white on the revolver's grip. He has to come down the hall. One choke point. Kodiak shrieked. It was the sound she had heard at the shelter, the sound of the truck brakes, the sound of his ultimate breaking point terror. But he wasn't in the kitchen. He was in the hall, just feet from her. "Cody, here!" she commanded, her voice cracking. "Watch him! Bark!" A 150-pound shadow, moving impossibly fast, erupted from the darkness. He was not charging the threat. He was fleeing. He was a torpedo of pure panic. He barreled past Alara, his massive shoulder slamming into her hip, knocking her hard against the doorframe. The impact sent a jolt of pain up her side, and almost made her drop the gun. He didn't look at her. He didn't pose. He scrambled, digging his claws into the hardwood floor, and hurled his entire body at the closet. He shoved his way past the flimsy bifold door, disappearing into the tiny dark space where Silas was hidden. A small, terrified cry came from the closet as the massive, terrified animal crashed in, seeking refuge behind the 9-year-old child. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, that Alara almost choked. The dog had not only failed, he had actively endangered her son, seeking the weakest member of the pack to hide behind. A sound from the kitchen snapped her back. Heavy, wet steps, slower now, confident. He's in. He's listening. Alara slammed the bedroom door. It was solid oak, the only thing of quality in the house. Her shaking left hand fumbled for the lock. Not a deadbolt, but an antique brass skeleton key lock. She turned the key. The click of the tumblers engaging felt pathetic, a child's defense against a monster. She backed away from the door, into the center of the dark room, raising the gun with both hands in a paramedic's steady, two-handed grip. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage at the dog. "Are you okay?" A tiny, muffled "yes" came from the closet. Then, heavy footsteps stopped on the other side of her door. The house, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the wind and the man. "You're in there, aren't you, Alara?" Finn's voice. It wasn't a shout. He was speaking calmly, his voice a low, rough baritone that carried easily under the door. He was close. He was enjoying this. "I saw you at the docks, driving your nice new SUV, you and the kid. Looked real peaceful, real intact." Alara's blood ran cold. He wasn't just here because he saw her. He was here because she had seen him. "You should have stayed in Portland, Alara," he continued, his tone conversational, as if they were old friends. "I did my time, 2 years. They said I was rehabilitated, but you being here, it just brings back bad memories." She could hear him leaning against the door. He wasn't even trying to break it down, not yet. He was savoring the terror. "He died fast, your husband. Did you know that? I saw him, after, before you got there with all your sirens." "Shut up!" Alara screamed, the words ripping from her throat. A hard metallic thunk struck the door, making her jump. "I don't think so." Finn's voice was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. "You're the witness. You're the loose end. You put me in that cage. You and that mute kid. It's not fair. I paid my debt. Now, you're gonna pay yours." Another thunk, harder this time. He wasn't just kicking it. He had a tool. The sound was metal on wood. He was checking its strength. Alara stood in the darkness, aiming the gun at the center of the door. She was trapped in a box, with a silent child and a cowardly dog, while the man who had destroyed her life patiently, methodically, began to take the door apart. The taunting stopped, replaced by the terrifying, methodical sound of work. A heavy metallic thunk bit deep into the oak door, followed by the agonizing screech of wood fibers tearing as he wrenched the tool back. It was an axe. He was breaching the door. Alara stood in the dark, her body rigid, her senses screaming. She aimed the .38 with both hands at the center of the door. Thunk! The wood splintered, a pale spider web visible in the gloom. Alara fired. The shot was catastrophic in the enclosed space. A deafening, percussive boom that was instantly swallowed by the storm. The flash was a blinding white-blue star, searing her retinas, and the smell of sulfur and cordite choked the air. A grunt from the hallway, followed by a low, furious laugh. "You did come to play!" Crash. The axe blade, wet with shot, burst through the panel near the lock. He was striking with precision, shattering the mechanism. Crash! The door flew open, slamming against the interior wall. For a beat, there was only the roaring void of the storm, a vortex of wind and rain invading the bedroom. Then, a light. A single, high-lumen tactical flashlight beam stabbed through the darkness, pinning Alara against the wall. She was blinded, a trembling silhouette in a nimbus of her own panicked breath. "Drop it," Finnan O'Doherty commanded. He stood in the doorway, a monster framed in the splintered wood, water streaming from his face and beard. He held the flashlight high tight to his head, and in his other hand, the camp axe dangled, its edge glinting. Alara kept the gun level, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the sight. "Get out! I'm warning you, Finn. Get out!" "You had your chance to leave, Alara." He stepped into the room, his boot crunching on the debris. The beam of light never left her face, a tool of pure intimidation. "You had to come here. You had to stay. You're the loose end." He took another step. He was close enough for her to smell the whiskey on his breath, a sour, sharp tang beneath the scent of the river. "You're a murderer," she hissed, squinting into the glare. "I'm a survivor," he spat. "But you looked just like he did, right at the end. That same stupid, surprised look." She pulled the trigger again. The shot was wild, the bullet whining past his head into the hallway. He didn't even flinch. He was on her before she could re-aim. He moved with a brutal prison yard speed. He didn't swing the blade of the axe. He swung the flat of it, a vicious, efficient arc. The solid steel head connected with her right forearm with a sickening, wet snap. Alara screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. The .38 flew from her numb, useless fingers, skittering across the hardwood floor and disappearing into the darkness under the bed. Pain, white-hot and electric, exploded up her arm. He was on her. He dropped the flashlight, letting it roll on the floor, its beam now pointing crazily at the ceiling, casting the room in a theater of lurching, monstrous shadows. He grabbed her by the hair with his left hand, yanking her head back, and slammed her against the wall. "You should have stayed gone," he hissed, his face inches from hers. He still had the axe. He brought it up, his knuckles brushing her cheek. He was savoring it. Pinning her with his body, he raised the axe high, preparing for the final, killing blow. And then, a new sound. It was a sound that did not belong to the storm, or the axe, or the gun. It was a sound that had not been heard in that house, or in the world, for how many days. "No!" The word was a physical explosion. It was high-pitched, rusty, and vibrating, with a year of silent, compressed fury. It tore through the room with more force than the wind. Finn froze. His head snapped toward the closet, his grip on the axe momentarily loosening. What the hell? The closet door, already weakened by Kodiak, burst open. Silas Vaughn stood there, a tiny 9-year-old pillar of absolute rage. His face was white, his eyes black, his small fists clenched. "Get off her!" Finn, utterly baffled by the speaking child, let out a short, surprised laugh. "Go back to sleep, kid. Your mom's just—" He never finished the sentence. A second shape erupted from the closet, moving past Silas with a speed that defied its size. It was not the 150-pound shivering victim. It was a 150-pound guardian. The snap of his mistress's bone, the metallic tang of her blood in the air, the proximity of the predator, and, above all, the sound of his boy's voice had finally broken the paralysis. The traumatic noise of the storm and the axe were irrelevant. This was not a wreck. This was not a failure. This was a rescue. The deep, dormant search and rescue training, the instinct to protect his handler, to neutralize the threat, roared to the surface. Kodiak did not bark. He did not growl. He acted. He moved in a blur of fur and muscle, a silent torpedo of protective rage. He covered the 10 feet in a single bound, launching himself from the floor. Finn, still pinning Alara, only had time to turn his head as the dog's jaws, designed to grip and hold, not to tear, clamped down on his right arm, the arm holding the axe. Kodiak's teeth sank deep, past the muscle, scraping bone. He pulled, using his entire 150-pound body weight, bracing his paws against the wall. Finn screamed. It was a high, thin, bubbling sound of agony and disbelief. The axe flew from his numb, punctured grasp and clattered across the floor. "Get off! Get off me, you fucking beast!" Finn roared, slamming his free fist into the side of Kodiak's head, but the dog's jaw was locked. This was his job. He had a target. Finn rolled away from Alara, trying to get leverage, but Kodiak was relentless. He was a Leonberger, a mountain dog, bred for pulling weight. He dragged the man, kicking and screaming, away from Alara and slammed him against the dresser, which splintered under the impact. Alara scrambled away, clutching her broken arm, her mind reeling, staring at the battle. "Cody!" Silas screamed, his voice clear and commanding. "Get him, Cody!" Hearing the boy's voice, Kodiak redoubled his effort. He released the shredded arm and, as Finn tried to stand, he lunged again. Not for the arm this time, for the threat. He lunged for the throat. Kodiak's lunge was not an attack. It was an execution of training. His jaws did not snap at the throat, but clamped onto the thick, corded muscle of Finn's shoulder and trapezius, using the man's own momentum to slam him backward. Finn, his scream of rage cut short by the impact, hit the wall with a sickening crack of his head against the plaster. The axe, still in his other hand, flew free. The man and the dog went down in a chaotic, thrashing heap. Finn roared, his voice a bubbling, inhuman sound, his free hand clawing at Kodiak's face, gouging at his eyes. But the dog, now fueled by a year of suppressed adrenaline and the sound of his boy's voice, was relentless. He held his grip, shaking his massive head, his paws digging into the floor. He was not a pet. He was a 150-pound anchor of pure, focused muscle. Ilara, clutching her broken, useless arm, scrambled backward, her mind a blinding white static of pain and shock. "Cody, hold him!" Silas screamed again. His voice was no longer a rusty shriek. It was a clear, sharp command. Finn, pinned against the floor by the dog's weight, tried to bring his knee up into Kodiak's stomach, but the dog was too heavy. The fight drained from Finn as the blood pooled on the floor beneath him, not from his throat, but from the shredded, ruined mess of his shoulder and the gash on the back of his head where he'd hit the wall. His movements became sluggish, his curses softened to a groan. Then, silence. The storm roared into the void. Kodiak did not release. He held his pin, his chest heaving, his muzzle dark. A low, controlled growl, the first true growl Ilara had ever heard from him, rumbled in his chest. Ilara stared at the scene. The man, the dog, the child, the storm. The pain in her arm was a distant, white-hot signal. "Mom?" The word cut through the chaos. Ilara's head snapped toward the closet. Silas was standing there, his sketchpad abandoned on the floor. His face was pale, streaked with tears, but his eyes were alive, alert. "Mom, your arm." The paramedic, the trained professional, shoved the victim aside. Ilara's mind cleared, the static resolving into a cold, sharp, linear process. Triage. "I'm okay," she lied, her voice a clinical calm. She slid down the wall, using her good hand to brace herself. Cody, off!" The dog didn't move. He was locked on the threat. "Cody, it's okay," Silas whispered, stepping forward. He put his small, trembling hand on the dog's massive, blood-slicked haunch. "He's down. Good boy. Off." With a deep, shuddering exhale, Kodiak released his grip. He backed away from Finn's unconscious body, his legs trembling from the exertion. He limped, favoring his left hind leg where Finn must have kicked him. He turned to Silas, his massive head low, and nudged the boy's chest, whining. Silas wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in his fur. "You saved us," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You saved us, you good boy. You're the best boy." Kodiak licked his face, a frantic, loving gesture, and the 172-day silence was officially, completely broken. Ilara's eyes moved to the man on her floor. Finn was alive. His breathing was shallow, gurgling. He was bleeding out. For a heartbeat, she let the hatred win. She could just wait. The storm, the bridge, no one was coming. It would be justice. She looked at Silas, who was whispering praise to their savior. She looked at her own hands, one broken, one covered in drywall dust. She thought of the oath she had taken, the oath she had abandoned when she'd fled to this town. "Silas," she said, her voice a sharp, professional command. "In my closet, my blue trauma bag, the big one, bring it to me, now." Silas didn't hesitate. He ran, retrieved the heavy nylon bag, and dragged it to her. Ilara fell onto her side, ignoring the agony in her arm. She unzipped the bag with her left hand and her teeth. The .38 revolver she had bought from Jean was still at the bottom, untouched. She ignored it. She pulled out what she needed: a roll of packing gauze, a 10-gauge decompression needle, a headlamp, and her handheld VHF radio. She strapped the headlamp on, its beam cutting a perfect surgical circle in the dark. She crawled to Finn. "Silas," she ordered, "hold this flashlight. Right here. Don't look away." She pressed her knee onto the pressure point above Finn's ruined shoulder, pushing her full weight down. Finn groaned. "He's alive," she muttered. She ripped the gauze packaging open with her teeth and began to pack the wound. A brutal, efficient act, her good hand moving with a speed that defied the darkness. She was not saving Finn. She was saving herself. She was not a killer. She was a paramedic. This was her house. This was her patient. This was her scene. As she worked, she grabbed the radio. She flicked it to the county dispatch frequency, a channel she knew by heart. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the static. "This is Paramedic Alara Vaughn, badge 922. I am at 415 Solitude Road, off Highway 30. I am cut off. The bridge is washed out. I have a single GSW. No, correction. One male, approximately 40 years old, unconscious, multiple severe lacerations, suspected arterial bleed and head trauma. He is the suspect in a home invasion." Static crackled back, a voice faint. "Repeat. 922, location is washed out." "Affirmative dispatch," Alara shouted, tying off a pressure bandage. "The bridge is gone. You will need air evac at first light. I have one other victim. Correction. One other survivor. My son, 9 years old. He is 10 to 4, uninjured. I am also injured. Compound fracture, right forearm. We are secure. The suspect is incapacitated." She looked at Finn's face, a mask of blood and rain. "But he is 10 to 9. He's critical. I need that evac. How copy?" The radio hissed. "But copy, 922. Air. First light. Hold on." Ilara let the radio fall. She looked at her work. The bleeding had slowed. She had saved him. The storm, as if its work was done, began to ease. The roaring wind settled into a grieving wail. Gray, watery light, the first hint of dawn, began to seep through the splintered door and broken window. It illuminated a scene of utter destruction. The shattered door, the overturned furniture, the dark spreading stain on the floor. And in the middle of it, a paramedic, clutching her broken arm, her face grim. In the corner, a small boy, whispering into the fur of an injured 150-pound hero. Kodiak, his tail thumping softly on the floor, was finally, truly home. Alara looked at her son, his voice a miracle. She looked at the dog, his courage a resurrection. She looked at her own bloody, capable hand. They were surrounded by wreckage, but for the first time in a year, nothing felt broken. They were all, in their own way, rescued. In the end, Kodiak was never a coward, and Silas was never truly silent. They were just waiting. God, in his infinite wisdom, didn't send Alara a perfect, fearless protector. He sent her a 50-pound mirror of her own trauma, knowing that only a dog who understood fear could be healed by a boy who had forgotten his own voice. The miracle on that dark, storm-tossed night wasn't the sound of the axe stopping. The miracle was the sound of a 9-year-old boy's voice, a voice that God had held in trust, released in a single word that shattered 172 days of silence to save his mother. That love was the spark. It reminded a failed dog of his true purpose, not to fear the past, but to protect the future. How often do we look at the broken pieces of our own lives, our grief, our fear, our failures, and believe we are useless? This story reminds us that God wastes nothing. He often uses our deepest wounds as the very channels for his greatest miracles. The part of you that feels failed or broken might just be the part he is waiting to use to save someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that their purpose is greater than their pain. We want to hear your story. Comment below. When has a moment of fear in your life, or the life of someone you love, turned into an unexpected act of courage? And to hear more stories that prove faith and courage can be found in the most unexpected places, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of hope. May the Lord bless every single person watching this. May he protect your families, fill your homes with strength, and give you the faith to see the hero he has already placed inside your own storm. Amen.